Joining us now from New York to talk about the crisis in Syria is Stephen Schlesinger. He's a senior fellow with the Century Foundation, a policy research organization. And with us from Las Vegas is Eric Draitser. He's an independent geopolitical analyst and commentator. And joining us from Los Angeles is the president and director of the International American Council in the Middle East, Majid Rafizadeh. Majid, I want to start with you in LA. We've seen this flurry of diplomatic activity, as Sean was just describing. Is there room for hope? Because there's been so much cynicism and division in the UN Security Council.
That's a great question, Nathan, and it's a complicated one, I have to say. Whenever you see there is a plan or peace plan, they call, which they had previously at the United Nations, the peace plan comes from the powers. Now, that could include Iran, regional powers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, or global powers like Russia and United States. And when you have a peace plan which comes from powers, it usually reflects the national and economic and geopolitical interests of those powers. It does not reflect the interest of the Syrian citizens. And we've seen that before. Even if you look at the history of the Middle East, which was divided and the boundaries were drawn, they were always plans from the powers how the Middle East or how different countries should be. And I think what you're seeing now is the same, is a reflection of the same mistake have done before. Iran is now offering some kind of dividing Syria into different parts. So these are all plans from powers, and they're not going to be lasting. They're not going to be forever because, again, they do not reflect the interest of the Syrian citizens.
This new approach, Stephen Schlesinger in New York, is about a sort of bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, isn't it? Just exactly as Majid was saying, the opposite. Does this stand a chance of working where plans of Kofi Annan and Lakhdar Brahimi in the past have failed?
Well, I think I'm not sure I fully agree with the correspondent out in L.A. Because, the UN negotiator, Italian diplomat named Stefan de Mistura, has talked to the parties both in the Syrian government and in the insurgent groups. So he is, in a sense, directly getting information and data and proposals from the people who are fighting in this conflict, which is actually the role the UN is supposed to be playing as a neutral arbiter. And so in that sense, I think he has come up with some ideas that may be productive in the long run. Obviously, after a conflict in which over 250,000 people have died, and there's been no response on either side to have some sort of peace deal. It is a very complicated situation. Yeah. But I think you have to give credit for the UN to hang in there. And I think one other thing, which is that, ironically, the day after the Security Council ratified this idea of this new plan, the Italian diplomat Stefan de Mistura actually came out and denounced the Syrian government for an attack on one of their towns called Douma, which almost 100 people died. Then the Syrian government denounced him. Yeah. So once again, we don't know where this is going to lead. Maybe the Syrians are going to just reject it.
Yeah, Eric, let's have a broader picture here, because what we're talking about here...
Nathan, can I add a point?
Yeah, go ahead, actually. But I wanted to address ISIL. Carry on.
Just quickly to respond. I think we should not really conflate our hopes with analysis. I think as scholars, if we do hope that the conflict will be resolved, but I think if you look at it really realistically, the conflict is a result of several concentric circles of tension. There are more than 1,000 rebel groups in Syria. So I think we shouldn't really be idealistic. Yeah, this plan is going to work and it's going to resolve the problems. I think we should look at the problem, I think, more meticulously.
Eric, I want to bring you in from Las Vegas, because what's united, albeit tentatively, these world powers has been the threat of ISIL across Syria and, of course, Iraq as well, is Islamic State. Do you think the powers can come together and cooperate? And in a way, has this proved the argument from Damascus that terrorism was going to take over in Syria right?
Well, certainly it's proven Damascus right that they have been making that claim really all along, that the real fight was a fight against international terrorism, and that the nature of the war in Syria was a terror war being waged by international forces against their country. That's really been their argument since 2011. They've stuck to that argument, and in fact, I think facts on the ground have really proven that true. But the larger picture, and I think what you're getting at with your question, is the fact that ISIS is really actually a pretext for a much larger geopolitical gambit by certain powers here. Remember that the United States and Turkey have taken unilateral action in bombing Syria, in bombing targets inside of Syria, both ISIL targets as well as Kurdish targets and others, and the establishment of the so-called buffer zone along the border, which is really an extension of the previous plan for humanitarian corridors and all of the rest of what the Turks have really been pushing for the last 2.5 years or so. So actually the notion that we're really moving into a new stage here, I think is a little bit far-fetched. Rather, I think this is a recasting of the policy that we've seen from Washington, and I would point people's attention to a very interesting paper from the Brookings Institution in late June of this year, I believe June 30th of 2015, called Deconstructing Syria, and they laid out quite clearly that this was the scenario, and the reason why, and this is pretty much plainly stated in their arguments, is that regime change does not seem to have worked, that the regime change scenario that they wanted to pursue against Assad and against that government has failed, their strategy has failed, and so now they're moving to a secondary strategy, which is a de facto partitioning of the country. The real question is along what lines and how this will be done, because of course the Geneva Communique, which is really the framework for all of these international negotiations, the Geneva Communique had no language with regard to anything about a transition away from Assad or about Assad's participation.
Right, Eric, the partition plan has been out there, but it's not part of policy going forward, but you're right, it has been discussed. Majid, before we go forward, he brings up Bashar al-Assad. Now, there seems to have been some movement with the US towards not necessarily calling for his ousting directly before any final peace deal. Let's listen to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, because they're still very much, it seems, behind keeping Bashar al-Assad in power.
I would very much like for any of the influential countries involved in the events around the Syrian crisis not to have any hopes that the problem of Bashar al-Assad can be solved by military means, because the only way for such a military solution would be seizing power by Islamic State and other terrorists.
Majid, what's the situation in terms, do you think, of Bashar al-Assad? Is it still a deal breaker, or is there some movement on the parties?
You know, Nathan, they talk a lot about Bashar al-Assad. I think we shouldn't really stick that much the question of whether Bashar al-Assad is the solution to the conflict. I talked to Iranian officials in DC, and what they say is that, you know, they're not married to an individual. They're not married to the President Bashar al-Assad. I think Russian government, Iranian government, they're not married to Bashar al-Assad, but they're married to the Alawite system of Syria because it preserved their own national and economic interest. So what I'm saying here is that they might agree to put Bashar al-Assad aside because, you know, this conflict is costly for them. I mean, Iran is not in a comfortable position. Iran does not want to be a hegemon power because it's a minority, and it's hemorrhaging billions of dollars. So I think they might agree to put aside Bashar al-Assad, but I don't think that there are, as I said, there are more than 1,000 of rebel groups. Some of them, they're not going to agree that Bashar al-Assad quit and leave peacefully somewhere. They want to bring him to the International Criminal Court. So the gap is really very deep to bridge here.
Stephen, I want to bring you here on the issue of Bashar al-Assad. Do you think the US is thinking now that ISIL is in control of vast swathes of territory, given the lessons of Libya and what's happening there after Gaddafi, even Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that perhaps looking again at someone like Bashar al-Assad, or at least the structure of his government remaining in place is not a bad thing going forward?
Yeah, I think that ISIL has changed the dynamics of the whole situation. Well, actually, there's a couple of things that have changed the dynamics, but ISIL is probably the most prominent one, because it's forced the United States to look at what the real challenge is in the Syrian conflict, which is again, this incredibly demonic group of insurgents called ISIL. But at the same time, we have the possible new potential agreement between the U.S. and Iran on the nuclear issue, which has also produced a change in mood in the fighting over Syria. Clearly, if the U.S. Congress eventually does support this agreement, I think it's going to make it possible for the U.S. and Iran to start talking a little more seriously about issues beyond just the nuclear issue. And I think that you're already starting to see some movement in all the different parties, because an agreement between the U.S., Iran, and the Western powers will have the impact of changing the whole parameters of what's going on in the Middle East. So I think all of this is very positive. Whether it will result in anything right away, that's to be seen.